everyone. This is Larry Stebbins, the Garden Father. I'll be doing a series of podcasts throughout the season, and you'll be hearing about my tips and suggestions and things that I learn along the way. This is episode 4, and today what we're going to be doing is taking some of the questions that you've sent me through the email and try to answer them the best I can in the few minutes we have available. And I promise those listeners that the next episode will be about composting and what we can do to make the best composting soil ready to use in our garden. Okay, now let's begin our show. Now the first question we have was on cover crops. And I know some of you wonder, what is that and should the home gardener even consider it? The answer is yes, most definitely. A cover crop basically is a plant that you plant in the garden, and it covers up soil that is basically bare, and you allow it to grow, and then you allow it to die back, and you work it into the soil. And with that, usually you get quite a few benefits. You can break up hard-packed soil because the roots can go deep, for example, or you can add nutrients to the soil from the plant itself. And sometimes just covering up the soil like that can help keep the weeds at bay. You know, typically farmers will use cover crops out in their fields. They'll harvest a crop such as corn, and after that, they'll follow with the planting perhaps of alfalfa. And what this does is allow the soil first not to be kept barren so that it could possibly have the topsoil blow away with heavy winds, but it also helps to bring nutrients back into the soil. Now the farmers will leave those crops on usually through the fall, maybe even into the early spring, and then they'll till them back into the soil and get ready for next year's plantings. Most gardeners don't have the luxury of having large plots of land where they can actually allow to become fallow, in other words, not planting a crop, and then have the ability to plant cover crops in that area and let it stand for a while. Because our space is usually too limited, and usually when we harvest something out, it's the end of the season, and we certainly don't have time to plant a cover crop at that time. So when is it right for the home gardener to use cover crops? In other words, to plant something in the soil that'll bring nutrients back in. Well, I usually do it in the late summer. I've had a practice of in my garlic beds, when I harvest them out about the first or second week in July, then there's time for me to plant a cover crop, and my favorite one at that time is buckwheat. Now it's a grain cover crop, but it grows quickly, and I let it grow up to be about a foot tall, and just before it goes into flower, I will then till it back into the soil and let it decompose. Keep the soil moist, cover it with about 4 or 5 inches of moist straw, and just let Mother Nature do the rest. If I'm going to plant garlic back into that same spot, I will then make sure that I till that into the soil back about the first or second week in August so that it has plenty of time to decompose. And then I can work the soil in, work the amendments in, and let it stay pat for about 6 to 8 weeks before I then plant my fall crop of garlic to be ready to harvest the following summer. So in the Pikes Peak region, it's hard to get things started in the mid to late fall because our weather can change to become very cold. So if you can get a vacant bed planted in a cover crop about the second week in September, and if you're lucky, it just may sprout a little bit, and it may be able to be of some benefit to you. Now, what are the important reasons, again, to why you want to use cover crops? And like I said before, one way is to introduce organic matter back into the soil. Another is to increase the bacteria and fungi that are associated with these cover crops that can be then initiated back into the soil through when they die and they're tilled back in. And another way is to stabilize the soil so that it's protected against the wind blowing away the topsoil. And those are very important reasons why you want to do a cover crop if you do have barren soil. Now, the 3 main types of cover crops usually are legumes, things like peas, that sort of thing. Brassicas, which you think about as in the cabbage family, and broccoli and Brussels sprouts, turnips, that sort of thing. And the other one is grains and grasses, things like buckwheat or annual rye. Those have often been used. Now, if you choose to use a legume crop as a cover crop, there are many to pick from. A lot of people use soybeans or just regular sprouting peas. Some will use clovers, both white and red, And another legume that people use is alfalfa. Before I plant these legumes, I will usually buy a small packet, and it's usually inexpensive, of what is called bean or pea inoculant. It basically has bacteria in it, which are nitrogen-fixing bacteria. And I will dust that into the soil before I plant any of these crops, because as the legumes grow, they will develop nodules on the roots that will house these beneficial bacteria that actually help bring atmospheric nitrogen back into the soil and fix themselves in these nodules and turn that nitrogen into soluble nitrogen so that plants can use it. So when you're ready to till in your legumes, be sure you don't take out the roots, because those have those nodules on them, which will then burst open and provide that nitrogen back into the soil. Another group of cover crops that are commonly used are from the Brassica family. Usually these are a mix of different mustards. Now, I tend to stay away from those mainly for the fact that they contain some chemicals in them that, when they break down, actually help repel or may even harm some insects. Now, that may be good if you have some harmful insects around that you want to repel or get rid of. But for me, I tend to stay away from them because I don't want to harm any of the insects in my garden, and hope that Mother Nature will bring them into balance if I properly plant and tend the soil. The last group are the cereal grains and grasses that can be added as cover crops. A common one many people use is buckwheat, because you can get that in the soil pretty early in the fall, and it will actually grow before the frost hits. But some people plant things like annual ryegrass. The trouble with any of these is if you don't work them into the soil and let them break down by the time you want to plant again, then of course you have a spot that may not be ready to receive the crops when it's due. So in a nutshell, use cover crops when you can to cover up bare soil, but again, make sure that you get them worked into the soil in plenty of time for planting. We had another question that a gardener sent in to me, and the question was, and this one was really a difficult one for me. It says, does it increase the nutrition in food when you use certain fertilizers? So, I understood that to mean that when certain fertilizers, can you use a certain fertilizer to increase the nutrition in vegetables? I tried to research that because I don't know if there's any quantitative data on that to substantiate that if you use things like fish emulsion, would your plants give you more vitamin A or something. So what I did is I tried to scour far and wide, and I couldn't find any research that supported it. But I do know that healthy plants bring bigger harvests. We know that. And we know that you need a good, healthy soil. And we'll talk about that with our next question coming up. And if you have those things, that your plants will then do the best they can do. Every plant brings some nutrients from the soil into them and incorporate them in, to make them what they are. We know that carrots, for example, have certain vitamins like vitamin A that they tend to produce when they have good soil qualities and so on. But is there vitamin A in the soil, so to speak? No, there isn't. The plants produce it from the nutrients that are available. So here's what I do know also, that if you have a well-balanced soil amendment program, then most likely you'll make available those macronutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, secondary nutrients like sulfur, calcium, and magnesium, and micronutrients like copper, iron, manganese, boron, iodine, cobalt, molybdenum, tin, nickel, fluorine, selenium, silicon, and chromium, to name just a few, to the plants. And they will uptake what they need. So I do just that and hope that Mother Nature does her job. Now, homemade compost is perhaps some of the best you can do, because it has usually a variety of nutrients in it that can be brought back into the soil. Now, another thing you can do is to add mineral supplements to your soil that have trace minerals. A common supplement that we use is called azomite, and you can find that at your local garden shops. And those will add a lot of trace minerals to the soil, and then your plant will basically have a menu of items that they can pick from to grow to be the healthiest that they can possibly be. Now, another thing I do to make sure that the plants can take up these minerals after I've added my organic material like my compost and the minerals like azomite is I will then use some sugars into the soil. And sugars such as dry molasses or unsulfured molasses or just plain old cane sugar. And I usually add about 2 to 4 cups of these per 4-foot by 8-foot bed and work it gently into the soil. And that acts like a sport drink for the bacteria and fungi so they can grow, they can break down the organic material so that the plants can then use those nutrients. So that's the best I could do with that question. Now another gardener asked, could you discuss more about the soil food web? I'll discuss this a little bit now, but there'll be more to say on that when we talk about composting. Now the soil food web means just kind of what it sounds like. What is in there that is interconnected, that make it all work? Well, that's usually all of the things that are living in there, the micro and macroorganisms. Micro being those things like protozoan, bacteria, fungi, and the macro things like the millipedes, centipedes, pill bugs, earthworms, soil mites, and those sorts of things. Those are all the ones we can see with our naked eye. Together, hopefully all working together, they form what's called the soil food web. But those organisms all have to work in harmony with the plants that grow in that soil as well. It's a relationship that go hand in hand throughout the growing season. Certain bacteria in the soil and certain fungi in the soil are related to certain plants that are growing in that area. Certain plants need the help of those bacteria and that specific fungi or fungi that are in there to help break down the nutrients that are specifically to be used by that plant. Soils and plants around the world, if they are in balance, will have their own set of bacteria and fungi along with the plants that grow along with them to make for a healthy ecosystem. Now there is a soil scientist, and her name is Dr. Elaine Ingram, and she has spent her lifetime working on soil chemistry and the relationship between all of the beneficial bacteria and fungi and the protozoans and such that live in the soil that bring about a healthy ecosystem. And you can find her on the web and research her work. It is just fascinating. Now the last question was about hoop tunnels and air circulation. And this is really an important question. Some people like to use hoops and cover their garden in the summertime and usually early spring to even into late fall to increase the season and also to protect their crops against hail and or things like wind or, even cold weather snaps that seem to happen. No matter how big or small your hoop tunnels are, the one important thing is they do need ventilation. Even on cool days, when the sun is shining, it can get pretty hot underneath those tunnels and damage your crops. So yes, you do need ventilation, and the best way is to have ends that open up, and sometimes sides that might roll up a little bit to allow the air to circulate. Now, a general rule of thumb when you build like a hoop tunnel greenhouse, one that you could walk in, is that you want about 20% of the surface area that receives light to be able to be open to the outside if need be. So 20% of that. So that means that if you have a hoop tunnel that is just all plastic covered, you want to usually have sides that roll up a little bit so they can ventilate. And that usually helps quite a bit. So, I hope if you're building a hoop tunnel, you consider the ventilation, because shutting them off completely can really damage your plants. Now, one last thing. I know that it's, for some of us, it's still winter. And we get a little antsy and want to start planting. We want to start things indoors, or we want to start things a little outside and in hoop tunnels and that sort of thing. But be patient, because I've found out that trying to rush crops in this cool weather usually stalls them in their growth, and it usually helps you get an early harvest if you try to get a little too much ahead of the game. So be patient. The warm weather will come, and come March or even into April, we'll be ready to plant out here in the Pikes Peak region, and we hopefully will be looking for a nice, long, gentle, warm, and moist summer. So this is Larry Stebbins signing off. Happy gardening.